Hello, everyone. This is Philosophy for the People with Stefan Bertram and Stefan Bertram alone. Ben is going to be not here this week after coming back for 1 week. He's not going to be here this week, and he's not going to be here next week. So I learned that yesterday, so I've whipped up something for today. But I'm open to suggestions for what I should do next week, and I'll return to that at the end of the show. I was triggered into thinking and talking about liberalism because of the recent Israeli invasion of Lebanon and the recent Iranian missile attack on Israel, where in response, especially the United States, but other Western governments, didn't really even make a fig leaf of going, well, no, Israel, you probably shouldn't invade another country. And in response to the Israeli missile attack, the Iranian missile attack, which was obviously a response to previous Israeli actions, which at least in principle the West was against. The United States just directly kind of encouraged Israeli bloodlust, encouraged these missile strikes. And that led, as people say to me, to lose the last bit of faith in liberalism that I didn't even know I had. And so I wanted to talk about kind of liberalism, how it relates to modernity, what it was, what the good stuff it did. Because I often say on this show, liberalism was the second best idea anyone's ever had. I do believe that generally. So I wanted to put that in conjunction with kind of the fall and decline of liberalism, talking about why liberalism as an ideological formation is kind of on its way out and what's kind of replacing it. And in this context, I will mainly be discussing kind of the domestic politics of the United States and the United Kingdom. But I will eventually go on to these foreign policy issues later on. So I was very... Tell me if the text is too small. There's not really anything I can do if it is, but tell me anyway, I guess. I try to come up with some principles of liberalism as I understand it without having Google search what is liberalism, because it's kind of less, this isn't politics 101. This is Stefan opinions on liberalism 101. I think at the center of liberalism and the focus throughout this kind of discussion today for me is the idea of universalism, which is the idea that everyone should be treated in the same way unless there's some reason to treat them otherwise, and there's always a preference towards treating them the same, understanding them in the same way. For instance, we accept that there is massive variation in humans and how they are, but apart from prohibiting children from voting, we accept the principle of one man, one vote. In the United States, there's also restrictions on prisoners from voting, but it's important to note that some people in the United States have 0 votes, some people have 1 vote, but no one has 2 votes. Though, for instance, in the United Kingdom, university graduates used to have 2 votes until 1945. So there's this idea of universalism. Related to this idea, and I think one that's very important for liberalism, one that I don't think is discussed enough, and one which seems to be one of the greatest innovations of liberalism, but one I think is held in a lot of suspicion by the contemporary left, is the idea of merit-based appointment. That the person hired to do X should be someone who's skilled in doing X, should be the most skilled person in doing X of the candidates that you have, and should not be your cousin, as was previously kind of done, and it shouldn't, as the dispute was maybe in the 19th century, it shouldn't be because they were Catholic or Protestant. And as the debate in the 20th century went, it shouldn't be because they were black and white. And unfortunately, kind of, I think we're re-emerging into the debate of whether they should be black or white or a man or woman. This debate seemed to be settled, but has now reappeared. And I think the third factor is some kind of bias in favor of freedom, which is the idea that generally people should be free to do a certain thing unless we have some good reason to think otherwise. And all of these three things are things that before the modernist state formation wouldn't really have been particularly relevant. Someone in chat asks, if you want to treat all people the same way, don't you end up needing everyone to be the same? I don't think that's true at all. No, I think kind of fundamentally liberalism is, we accept that difference exists, but we don't think the state needs to legislate on that basis, or at least needs to legislate on that basis very often. Rather, we take it that people are fundamentally similar in the ways that matter, or at least we should pretend that they are, and that gets us nearly all the way in terms of how the state should interact with its citizens. It's going to say subjects. So it's very important to include the modernist state in this conversation, especially because while liberalism is now fading, I think the modernist state is definitely not. Rather, each year the state becomes more and more intensely involved in our lives, such that I think that these days it's hard for people to imagine how life was before there was this intensive state, or there was any really state at all. There was this revolution in human life, well, there was lots of them actually, that saw it become plausible for there to be this thing called the state, which is able to intervene significantly in the daily life of people. We can talk about being treated fairly or unfairly by the state, but this only becomes relevant when we're in a circumstance where we might actually be treated, where we might have some significant interaction with the state, as opposed to pre-modern people who, for the vast majority of them, had no real interaction with their government, even if they lived in a state society like Roman people who lived in the Roman Empire did. Unless they were living in Rome or in certain other places, their interactions with the state were very minimal, while our interactions with the state are incredibly intensive and continuous. It wasn't particularly relevant to have to worry about who exactly got government jobs or what laws should govern who got what jobs in the private sphere or whatever you want to understand it as, because the government didn't hire very many people and they didn't have the authority really to impose hiring practices on anyone else. While now we have a state, for instance, in the United Kingdom, I don't know what the figure is in the United States. In the United Kingdom, the state spends about half the GDP. Half of the GDP in the UK is directly spent by the state, and it employs an enormous share of the population. And I imagine the same is more or less true also in the United States, just to a less degree. We also, this kind of freedom I discussed is only relevant for liberalism to have this bias in favor of freedom because it granted itself, this modernist state formation, this revolution in human life, granted whatever state authorities existed the power to actually intensively intervene in their lives. And so this bias towards freedom became important in liberalism exactly because it had the power to do otherwise. I think that's an important point which is often neglected, that we should only say that someone has the power to do something or even the power not to do something when there's a possibility otherwise. Like, you have this idea of like trad reaction, where you want to intensively intervene in personal and public life. But really, if they were real trads, they would want to kind of dismantle the state sufficiently that it was impossible for anyone to really do that at all. My suggestion is that ideological liberalism is both exhausted, it's kind of at its end of its tether, but is being hammered on by people across the political spectrum. And this comes with various positive features. And this decline means a decline in its positive approaches, the positive things that were about liberalism and its approach to the state. So the state continues to grow in our present moment. This hasn't stopped; it's continued throughout modernity and got more and more intense in its domination of the people and its observation of the people. But now, as liberalism is fading, how this state will intervene in our lives becomes especially kind of scary or whatever. It's interesting that this also comes alongside kind of an almost complete rejection of economic planning, where there's still this marriage to the idea of laissez-faire capitalism, but not a commitment to individual freedom. Freedom of capital is continually re-emphasized, obviously because bourgeois states are bought and owned by the bourgeois, unsurprisingly, regardless of any democratic credentials. But there's a complete and becoming much more intense willingness to manage and constrain the actions of particular persons. So, for instance, the Conservative government, our previous Conservative government, was completely unwilling to have any form of economic planning, to accept that the state, the country, the economy of the country they governed was primarily consisted of government spending, and in that case, you should obviously have a plan for kind of the development of this country. So it's completely unwilling to do that, but it's completely willing, on the other hand, to pass laws which managed exactly where shops could put chocolates and discount chocolates in the shop as an intervention to try and stop people being fat and unhealthy more generally. Yes, I mean, there definitely is a dictatorship to bureaucracy, but it's a very kind of reluctant and dismal dictatorship where the political class especially don't want to accept the fact that they have this complete domination over the political economy of Western countries, um, while they intensify their kind of domination over us as they try and ban cigarettes as they currently are in the United Kingdom. I take it that liberalism is something which is under attack from both the left and the right. These ideas of universalism are being widely rejected in favour of particularism. This is kind of the point I'm going to return to throughout this thesis, which I think was best provided in the example my mind constantly goes back to, was the Californian state government holding a referendum to remove language in their state constitution which dictated that everyone be treated equally under the law. They wanted to remove this in order to institute positive discrimination. I'm pretty sure in education, what's called in the United States affirmative action. But I think it's really a warning sign for liberalism and a warning sign for all of us that this kind of legislation, which seeks to abolish equality under the law, is being portrayed and pushed by progressives. Or there's a struggle with kind of language in this bit, because what would normally be called the liberal left, I'm suggesting isn't liberal, and so I'll say the post-liberal left. But there's a kind of confusion there where post-liberal left means something like some kind of quite deep leftist. But I'll be using leftist mostly here to denote kind of left liberalism, so-called left liberalism, which I just don't think is liberal at all anymore. Ideas of merit are widely disdained, which again we can see in affirmative action. And quite incredibly, the latest US Republican campaign is campaigning on the basis of instituting a spoil system in the US civil service. They're promising to fire all the woke bureaucrats and return to having Republican based bureaucrats, where there seems to be no concern at all from them that actually maybe the people that should be bureaucrats or people that are good at being bureaucrats, that's something which is seemingly taken for granted or seen as basically irrelevant. And freedom is regarded with great suspicion, with the focus instead on harm. There's all these, in the Eye Kingdom, there's a continual effort to ban everything because it's harmful, which then kind of links up into our NHS cult, where, you're not free, you shouldn't be allowed to smoke cigarettes because even if you're just doing it in your own home by yourself and no one else there, or you're smoking out the window or whatever, that's impermissible, even though it's a choice which seemingly only refers to yourself, because it's taken to unfortunately implicate our grand and beautiful National Health Service by imposing certain costs upon them when you allegedly have to go to them for care because you've been smoking. No one told me we were doing slides now. I did slides once before and everyone really loved it, so I'm back on the slides. These aren't particularly good slides because I just started them last evening, really just today. But yeah, we are slided up. Why don't we like liberalism anymore? I think this is a kind of fundamental point. I outlined these kind of features of liberalism in the first slide, and this came with this further promise that by achieving these things, we would achieve brotherhood between men. That there would be not an equality of kind of wealth, though there wouldn't be an extreme inequality of wealth, but rather that kind of social problems and social dispute would be resolved, that we wouldn't be a society that's at war with itself. Notably, however, as you may have noticed, this has not happened. The problem for liberalism is that we've done exactly as it suggested. We have followed this schematic from the 19th century, which has said that we need to abolish all these laws, these unfair, unequal laws which discriminate between persons on bases which can't be justified. And it took a long time for this to happen because, of course, during the American Revolution, they were saying this and keeping slaves. And then during the women's rights movement, they were saying this, but denying the vote to black people. And then eventually we had the civil rights movement, and at that point, broadly, finally, in the United States, there was equality under the law. Bless me. And in terms of social liberalism, much more has been done to try and ameliorate social problems, to kind of trying to ameliorate the structure and relationship with capitalism, which is, of course, the fundamental problem here, that liberalism can't resolve social disputes, social problems, social contradictions, and all these other things because it's fundamentally based upon capitalism. And capitalism, as we know, if we're at least a little bit Marxist, is this economic system which is riven by contradictions, which is riven by a constant desire to kind of plumb the debts, to press down upon things, to extract as much profit as they can, and all these things inevitably cause, this race to the bottom, if not continually opposed by a strong workers' movement, and these things are continually struggle, a battle, a fight. But instead of anything else happening, we live in a society where a tiny elite intensively exploits us, and we're also increasingly divided based on identity politics. People increasingly see themselves, well, I mean, It probably kind of never stopped happening, but I think it's really re-intensifying now on the basis of being a certain gender, being a certain race. These things are continually emphasized and pushed by the progressive left, or whatever you want to call them, as well as from the right. Especially the right is really intensified. It was the idea that the right was against identity politics was always a bit of an unconvincing kind of proposition. But with Israel's recent genocidal campaigns, it's become incredibly unconvincing as they turn to complete idbol, idbol, idpol bullshit in defense of Israel, and increasingly because white nationalists are becoming more and more openly present and influential on the right. They're just directly doing identity politics for themselves. So identity politics obviously has its ancestry in attempts not at particularism, but attempts at achieving universal rights. It emerges out of campaigns in the 1960s for civil rights, for the legalization and acceptance of homosexuality, which definitely saw themselves as universalist movements, movements that wanted these people to have the same rights as everyone else, as well as being linked to kind of the progressive workers' movement. The Brotherhood of Men is always an idea that was a mirage, and it's probably always going to be a mirage. But it's notable that identity politics has become risen to its strongest point exactly at the point where it's the most true. We're not at the peak of racism, we're not at the peak of sexism. We're at a point where men and women, black and white, live more lives more similar to each other than they ever have before, especially in relation to an elite which is just absolutely spinning away. In some cases, literally spinning away directly into space or into bunkers underground, because they're rather kind of more positive about the possibilities of a workers' revolution than I think most leftists are. I think identity politics, importantly, doesn't just claim particular features, but particular injuries. It's taken that it's not just that there are women or black people, but and that they should organize on the basis, in a political sense, of being black or being women, but that social problems are seen as belonging, in some sense, to this group. That issues of rape, for instance, belong to this identity politics-based women's movement. The issues of police brutality belong to this kind of black identity politics. And these injuries are also, I think, kind of the most unfortunate feature of this framing is these injuries are framed in terms of being contrasted with another imagined uninjured identity of a straight white male etc. person, which of course has this continual feature of normalizing whatever moment of capitalism you're in. If you're making these claims of injury on the basis of kind of this white male blah 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 person being uninjured, all you're ultimately demanding is to be subjected under whatever form of capitalist domination that we presently have in a slightly different way. I already noted about Pitbull kind of exploding once again on the right. I also take it that both sides of mainstream politics take it that their side are the only ones who really believe in freedom, with the other side being essentially fascist freedom haters. I think it's an interesting feature where freedom, the word, is not regarded as the word freedom is something you need to defend. Everyone wants to be free. Freedom's great. Freedom is in Coca-Cola adverts. Freedom is in McDonald's adverts. It's very important to be free. But the actual expressions of freedom are regarded with great suspicion. So everyone wants to be the party of freedom and will portray the other side as the party of unfreedom who hates freedom, while concretely not really supporting any freedom at all. Both sides will sometimes acknowledge that they're trying to limit certain freedoms, but only because they regard these freedoms as monstrous ones. In the case of abortion, the right portrays the liberal left or the post-liberal left or whatever we're going to say, the progressive left, as supporting murder, the murder of children, the brutal and unpleasant mass murder of children, while the progressive left, when the right kind of makes some pretense of supporting freedom of speech, will act as if by wanting widespread kind of protection of speech, these people, just are defending racial slurs. There's nothing else that they care about. What they're defending is, when imposing hate speech laws, the only reason you do that is because you actually just want to scream racial slurs 24/7. It's hard to imagine there being really anyone anymore that supports free speech. And obviously, this has become, again, something that's really been made very obvious by the Israel situation, where the right wants to basically throw you in prison for not supporting Israel. I mean, it's been something for a while, for a long time. BDS, anti-BDS laws are widespread in the United States, where you have to, sign a declaration declaring your pride and loyalty in Israel if you want a job in lots of Republican states, red states, whatever you call them. And on the other side, while the progressive left are allegedly, the great defenders of abortion rights, they don't actually support universal health care. And if you can kind of get free abortions on the kind of bills they're proposing, it's in the form of basically these charitable institutions like Planned Parenthood. It's interesting because in the UK we have the NHS, and it seems the closest equivalent in the United States is Planned Parenthood in terms of this thing which is made out by, it's like the hero, the institutional hero of the progressive left. But the nice thing I'd say about the NHS compared to Planned Parenthood is that we're never asked to donate to the NHS, because Planned Parenthood, regardless of what else it is basically the United States structured as a charity. Where is this all going? Where do the attacks on liberalism lead us? I take it that more and more explicit attacks on principles of liberalism will come. Universalism will be thrown out in favor of particularism. Merit will be thrown out in favor of a group or ideological preference. Freedom will be regarded as something that most cannot be trusted with. And especially in this context, I think it's important to note this isn't normally on the right. This will often be structured in an elitist way to say, as in, the best of us should be free to be free, but most people can't be trusted with this freedom. But I think instead on the progressive left, who are influenced by ideas such as privilege, it's a struggle to see anyone that can be trusted with freedom. Because of course, there's the chuds and the shitlords and whatever who can't be trusted with freedom because they're racist and so on. But because of the suggestions from privilege and other kinds of similar ideas, there is a notion that no one can be really trusted, because even if you're explicitly anti-racist, there's deep, spooky racism and so on hidden inside you, which expresses itself unconsciously and various privileged behaviors. And as long as you're part of these groups on the top, you'll always be privileged, unless you can always be held in suspicion. The problem, well, the problem for the Western order in regards to the decline of liberalism is that the Western liberal world exists in relation to the rest of the world. It doesn't seem that way sometimes, but there is an outside to the Western liberal world where the vast majority of human beings live. And in this way, and of course, this Western world rules over this external world. And the rest of the world that it rules over, the liberal world, needs some way to distinguish itself from this world. Structurally, the Western Empire is not breaking down. Well, I mean, we talked about it a couple weeks ago. It is declining, but it's not really on the edge. It's far further from the edge, I think, than Western liberalism is. I think Western liberalism is going to fall much faster and earlier than the Western Empire is. But it's created a problem because these ideas of liberalism are the kind of fundamental basis upon which the West's domination of the world is justified. Wait, hold on. Let me check my slides. Oh, I thought I had another slide. Clearly I do not. Okay. I'd also suggest that while democracy is under assault, and that is something that's really is really pushed by the progressive left in the United States, the idea that democracy is under assault, that if Trump wins, then democracy is over, despite the fact that he was already president, and democracy wasn't over, and his efforts otherwise were rather pretty dismal. I think ideologically, materially, at least the basic structure of electoral politics will remain in the West for a long time, if simply for the fact that there's no real way, there's no alternative. If the Republican Party actually kind of abolished democracy in the United States, this wouldn't mean an end to presidential elections. It wouldn't mean an end to congressional elections or Senate elections or state government elections. It would just mean that these elections would stop being competitive. I think the main way that the West distinguishes itself from the rest of the world, and I think it's notable that it does it in this way compared to how it might do it otherwise, is the idea that it is democratic and the rest of the world isn't. And that's interesting because everywhere in the world, apart from Saudi Arabia and a couple of the Gulf states, and maybe like one in no, was it Nepal? Is it? Whatever. 99% of the countries of the world have democratic structures, but the West declares that all the elections outside of it, which it doesn't like, are fake. They aren't competitive. There's these proper elections which happen in the West, which are competitive, which basically means, there's different candidates who could plausibly reasonably win. Whether or not they would actually do anything different in office doesn't matter. All that matters is the pantomime where you have this kind of genuine fake choice. You really have a choice between these two people, but the choice between the two of them is an inconsequential choice. Plausibly, as the West turns away from universalism and towards particularism, it will just insist that its particularism is the good particularism. Lebanon will have sectarianism, India will have a caste system, but we will just have a proper system of racial preference. However that turns out, whether the right wins that argument or the left, the West will have its system of racial preference. I don't know. I think it's not pushed as much in the United States, but there's especially this thing in the United Kingdom where, especially the police, try to manage manage British society through communities, which is basically this explicit sop to particularism, where and sectarianism and so on, where instead of kind of governing on a universal basis, the police will act through community intermediaries within certain religious and racial groups to kind of better manage the people in them, which is of course very evocative of what the British Empire did, did, which is very interesting in the sense of it's often these imperial techniques often end up coming home, and in this case, managing largely the descendants of the people who were managed in the imperial colonies by these techniques. It's also, I didn't quite finish this kind of thought, but I think it's also very notable that we live in an unprecedented era of the power of the courts, with representative structures, as in kind of democratic structures, seemingly willing to hand everything over to these groups. The law, it seems that there's a continual expansion in the United States and the United Kingdom of the power of the courts. And while there may be talk in Congress and sometimes also talk in Parliament of the very different, it's kind of the progressive left in the United States who makes some sop of trying to limit the power of the Supreme Court, while in the United Kingdom it's the right wing which is trying to do that, presumably because the court is regarded as right wing in the United States and the courts are regarded as liberal or post liberal in the United Kingdom. But I think expanding the power of the courts fits very well with this kind of post universal kind of ideology, where instead the courts stop and limit the power of the state to make universal laws on the basis of it violating, for instance, human rights, or especially in the United States on the basis of violating the Constitution. So there's this inherent kind of limit on the ability of democratic structures to be actually democratic, because they have to obey these courts who continually restrict them on the basis of ideas of rights and of the constitutions. However, these efforts towards particularism are limited by the fact that these courts are mainly operating off of universalist law, of constitutions and principles, which come from the peak ages of liberalism. Um, while obviously the United States Constitution was written and rewritten from the late 18th century to the 1950s, while EU kind of European Court of Human Rights law was something which is also based on the UN Declaration of Human Rights and similar ideas. So if they really want to do particularism, they kind of need to not just revolutionize the California state constitution, but the Constitution of the United States. But this is something which is probably not completely impossible, because I think both the new left and the new right agree on abolishing universalism. So while it's likely that we will maintain this democratic structure, it's not really It's not really clear why ideologically we should. Beyond again the idea that there's just no clear alternative possibility of how governance would work. One man, one vote is something which is only questioned on the fringe right. But if we reject the brotherhood of men, it's not really clear why it should be true. Why, on kind of a woke basis, should a straight white male have the power to elect someone who will make laws that will impose themselves on discriminated against as it's understood groups, or more accurately, failed to make whatever new laws are regarded as essential. Uh, these white males who won't vote for the people that will make enough hate crime laws, and so on and so on. And one way that the Western states cope with this is handing over more and more power to the courts. But of course, in the end, I mean, far more than the average voter. The courts are dominated by straight white male, blah 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 blah. And efforts to abolish this are hampered by the movement between the left and right, especially will be hampered even more as the right kind of openly accepts white, dominant, white and male identity politics. I don't know if anyone saw, especially the Americans and so on, and listening, but the woman who's currently leading the race to become the next Tory leader, she's a black British woman. She suggested that some cultures are superior to other cultures, but wouldn't say which cultures are superior to other cultures. And when pressed upon, well, what is a feature of a culture which might make a culture bad, she said a hate or a disdain for Israel. There is, of course, a possibility, at least in hypothetical terms, of rejuvenation of universalism based on the principles of Marxist socialism. This is in some sense exactly what we're crying out for at the moment. That, liberalism is dying, all these other kind of unpleasant particularisms are being suggested. But hypothetically, Marxist socialism could come along and suggest, no, we're doing universalism, but we're actually this time we're doing the brotherhood of men for real by abolishing capitalism, which is the fundamental thing which stands in the way of this brotherhood of men. We're no longer alienated by these formal laws, but rather we're alienated from each other by this economic separation, by this economic domination, and so on and so on. Unfortunately, the Marxist left is influenced by particularist ideas. Generally, Marxists are probably on average less accepting of identity politics than other groups, but largely are still accepting of identity politics. But the Marxist left is also making up even more aggressive and unpleasant forms of identity politics. For instance, land back and these sort of incredibly particularist ideas based on ancient tribal structures and so on, as well as these new forms of workers' particularism, such as shown in the ideas of the new American Communist Party, which seeks to exclude categories of workers because they find them culturally unappealing, as noted by Secret in the chat. This is the baristas aren't proletarian, and ultimately, as many works of Marx they may quote to justify this idea, its origin is not in Marx, but its origin is in wanting to be on a certain side of a current American culture war, and any Marxist justification for baristas or anyone else not being proletarian is just a secondary attempt to justify the idea after having it emerge from an American culture war. Oh. And that's the end. I didn't make a concluding slide. So I'll go back and read chat for a bit, as well as if anyone wants to ask any explicit questions now. But also, beyond what's been said now, if anyone has suggestions for what I should talk about next week, uh, put them in the chat now or over the next 15 minutes. I'm now quite inclined to do on culture war, but I don't really know what I would exactly do on culture war. I just have the idea now. It's appealing to talk about that. Yeah, but obviously, kind of when this idea came out, it wasn't something that was being proffered by communists. It was something that was being proffered by the Republican right, and then the Republican right is now so much further along that they would never want to. They'd obviously still kind of promote certain kind of work. Especially, I think this will intensify because they want to promote certain forms of gender work because they want to revalorize the idea of masculinity as kind of a sop to avoid actually doing anything for working people. But yes. Yeah, I mean, they seem to be dreaming small, as you might say. It seems that anarchists often frame things in terms of these very low level forms of social organization, which directly seem like backward steps from what we presently have now. And when are questioned on the basis of, well, under this society, how would we have these various incredibly useful technological things that we have now? They say either, well, we wouldn't, or they come up with, these very empty suggestions of, well, if various people want it, then it would happen. But this doesn't really. There's no kind of explanation how the cobalt will get from Congo to wherever it needs to be. Um, I don't think I really know anything much about that really. Probably when Ben comes back. I don't know. We might do some more episodes on libertarians. We've already done quite a few episodes on libertarians, but on the autonomous nationalists, the right wing anarchists, whatever you want to call them. Um, I don't really know anything. Uh, the positive thing about no one making any suggestions for what I should do next week. Well, I mean, there's been one suggestion. Um, the bright side of there not being more is that I just don't get to pick. Well, I think both are true. That there is a kind of this managed decline of the importance of the legislator, but I don't think that in any way excludes the rise of the courts. I think the rise of the courts is something which is really undeniable, especially in the United Kingdom where we didn't have a Supreme Court until 2008 or something, and then we suddenly had one, even though it made no sense and wasn't needed at all for the structure of how our country worked. We suddenly just had one because that's what Blairism was about. Um, no, 'cause I don't know what that is. Or maybe I do actually, but regardless, I definitely don't know enough to do a show on it. Okay, yeah, I mean, I do actually know about these people. I've read about them before, but like, I don't know how you think I would do an hour on them, apart from being saying that's neat. I mean, if there's any suggestion, I might think that their kind of structure is more. I mean, it's only interesting in the sense of like a world building sense. Like, it would be fun to have a fantasy or sci-fi society that structures daily life in the sense that these people do. Um, but I don't think it's at all interesting in a political sense because ultimately what I want to do is not to manage. I don't want to manage the personal lives of various people. I don't want to make a blueprint for managing the personal and social lives of ordinary people. Rather, I want to abolish the conditions upon which um, that is a political possibility. I don't think they're at all Marxist. I don't really know what that would mean, Robert. I mean, they're certainly not communists in the sense that while they kind of they do this kind of household to household thing instead of having the households don't break up upon people don't leave households upon marriage, rather they stay within the households. But that doesn't stop rich people being rich and rich households from being rich and poor households from being poor. I mean, I don't see how that's true at all. When it used to be that Congress had to approve foreign policy. Congress used to. It's hard to imagine, but when the US used to do military adventures all across the world, um, in the heady days of 1999, or whenever this principle was still followed, they had to be approved by Congress. Um, Not so anymore. International treaties used to have to be proposed by Congress. I mean, that's probably still the case, but structurally, it's not the case because I guess the United States just does agreements with foreign countries without them formally being the sort of foreign agreement that has to pass through the Congress. Um, I did actually do a show on Foundation on Doug Lane's channel a while back. I think if I was going to do another sci-fi chat of that kind, I'd do the culture. I wouldn't do Foundation because I don't think Foundation is some kind of communist thing. Is that basis? I mean, obviously, is that interesting? Obviously, I didn't do the June show on any basis of communism. I discussed it in the sense of a literary interpretation of heroism. But of course, the problem with Foundation is that Foundation has like I was going to say it doesn't have interesting characters, but structurally, basically, doesn't have characters. It's written in this incredibly old-fashioned sci-fi way where you're basically being monologued out, and there's these just dry cut-out characters who are there to be like, and then the human empire did this, and then the human empire did this, and it's an interesting enough story. Um, but not one I could really engage with on a character basis, and one which I can't really think I can engage with on a basis of kind of political engagement. No, Soon hasn't even read them. Psychohistory's no, it's definitely not Marxism. It's way more deterministic than Marxism. Did anyone say anything interesting earlier in the show? I'm just leaning down in my chair until I'm not on screen. The Platform 2019. This is what I've seen advertised on Netflix. The Platform. Yeah, I've seen the Platform 2 advertised on Netflix. Dystopian thriller film. What if I watched it and said actually the dystopian society is based and cool? Oh, this. Oh, right. This eating thingy. It's it's a bit of a like prisoner dilemma, collective action problem thingy. I'd heard of this. Oh, it's a movie. I thought it was a TV show. It's an explanation of the importance of individual initiative in driving political change that critiques both capitalism and socialism. Wow, no one's ever done that before. Yeah, I'll be sure to. I guess the problem is here. I obviously know what I know about, but you guys probably don't know what I know about. And so, in this context, me asking you for suggestions about what I should talk about next week, with literally no bounding conditions at all, was a bit dumb on my part. Because I then just go, "Well, no, actually, I haven't. I don't know anything about that at all." Uh, well, on that basis, on me asking silly questions, um, I will leave you all. Bye.